It is the part of wisdom never to revisit a wilderness.
It is the part of wisdom never to revisit a wilderness.
It is the part of wisdom never to revisit a wilderness, for the more golden the lily, the more certain that someone has gilded it. To return not only spoils a trip, but tarnishes a memory.
Never to revisit.
Humans are part of wilderness.
I don't actually want to imagine what it looks like now.
You never want to go back there thinking that it's just not quite going to be the same. That strikes me as a little sad.
When I first read the opening passage of the Green Lagoons, I was baffled, betrayed almost. This wisdom didn't fit into what I knew at that point of Leopold's image as a conservationist. His land ethic idea, after all, seems to demand not just revisiting a place, but carefully, mindfully cultivating a relationship with it. My bafflement and sense of betrayal stemmed from my own relationships to wilderness. Leopold's words cut me somewhere deep, hit me where my reflexive reaction was defensiveness. If I even imagined never going back to the wildness I now called home, I felt untethered, gutted. How could he suggest such a thing? I could understand him feeling cynical and pessimistic about what might have happened to the places he'd revered, but to put that on the rest of us? To act like this was some common adage, shared cultural understanding? That indignation, though, paved the way for obsessive curiosity. What did he mean by this wisdom? How did it fit into the bigger picture? Leopold as 20th century conservation legend, as purveyor of the land ethic, as steward of the shack, as a human being connected to Earth and its wildness. For months I scoured the almanac, pored over his other writings, peeled back history to reveal the biographical context. It so happens that 2024 is an anniversary year, which creates a platform for commemoration, reflection, and investigation of Leopold's legacy. A Sand County almanac turns 75. The Gila Wilderness, the first area of its kind designated in the United States and by Leopold himself, celebrates its centennial. This milestone convergence provides a unique opportunity to analyze a Sand County almanac and understand how Leopold's writing and conservation ideas contributed to both the tangible and conceptual legacy of wilderness. The Green Lagoons, apart from sticking like a thorn in my side and plaguing my thoughts for the better part of a year, offers a unique glimpse into Leopold's experience of wilderness. The idea of never revisiting reveals the role emotions like ecological grief and anxiety played in the protection of wild places. While Leopold didn't have access to our modern terminology, many examples within his writing and lived experience convey his pain over altered landscapes and other irrevocable losses within the biotic community. Many people point to Leopold himself as one of the first writers to put these feelings of ecological grief to paper. In his essay Round River, which is included in some editions of the almanac, he writes, "One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds." This sense that we are within a world of wounds is only becoming more prevalent in our current era, and Leopold's experiences indeed hold quite a bit of wisdom on what these never revisiting feelings mean, why they matter, and what they can tell us about the value of wilderness and wildness in our connections to nature. In the Green Lagoons, Leopold recounts a canoe trip that he and his brother took in the Colorado River Delta in 1922. This voyage and other journeys in Mexico opened Aldo's eyes to the existence of lush and magnificent landscapes, untouched by development, and informed his idea of unspoiled nature. When the sun peeped over the Sierra Madre, he writes, It slanted across 100 miles of lovely desolation, a vast flat bowl of wilderness rimmed by jagged peaks. This landscape was, of course, defined by its river, both nowhere and everywhere, a body of water that could not decide which of 100 green lagoons offered the most pleasant and least speedy path to the Gulf. So he traveled them all, and so did we. It was by no means an entirely human-free setting. Leopold remarks on the history of conquistadors that arrived there in the 1500s, but suggests that the delta had lain forgotten since then, for when he and his brother camped on the estuary which is said to have harbored Hernando de Alarcon's ships, they had not for weeks seen a man or a cow, an axe cut or a fence. The glory and wonder in this place came from its reminders that people are not the be-all end-all, that civilizing, taming, and developing are not the only ways to engage with land. On the one hand, this liberated the brothers. Never did we plan the morrow, Leopold writes, for we had learned that in the wilderness, some new and irresistible distraction is sure to turn up each day before breakfast. Like the river, we were free to wander. Newness, exploration, and discovery define wilderness and what it means for humans to exist within it. But these are not the only defining qualities of wilderness. Natural landscapes impose boundaries on these freedoms and upend the idea of human supremacy. Wildness means tangible danger and mortal threats. The great salt deserts, tall, spear-like thickets which opposed our passage, and perhaps the greatest threat of all, the despot of the delta, the great jaguar, El Tigre, whose personality pervaded the wilderness. No living beast forgot his potential presence, for the price of unwariness was death. In spite of his awe and reverence at this place and all that it represented for him, Leopold's nostalgia in the Green Lagoons is bracketed by lament. He opens the essay warning never to revisit a wilderness, for it is only in the mind that shining adventure remains forever bright. And he closes with the revelation that the Green Lagoons now raise cantaloupes, indicating the agricultural land use shift that obliterated the lagoon's wildness. Man always kills the thing he loves, he concludes, and so we, the pioneers, have killed our wilderness. Notably, Leopold expresses a nearly identical sentiment in a different essay, On Top, where he reflects on his time in the White Mountain of Arizona. This peak served as another reminder of humans' mercy to the forces of nature. The mountain in summer had as many moods as there were days and weathers, he recounts, with fair weather inviting you to get down and roll in its new grass and flowers, while massive pines and firs soaked up the sun in towering dignity. Never had there been so rare a day or so rich a solitude to spend it in. This peaceful Eden could transform in a matter of hours, though, your erstwhile paradise cowering under the impending lash of lightning, rain, and hail. Black gloom hung poised as over a bomb with the fuse lighted. Even in the midst of near-apocalyptic terror, he remarks that it must be poor life that achieves freedom from fear. Beholding the full spectrum of nature's wonders, beauty to horror, tranquility to adrenaline-fueled survival instinct, is essential to the experience of awe, which is what gives a place its wild character. At the end of this piece, though, he confesses that, despite several opportunities to do so, I have never returned to the White Mountain. I prefer not to see what tourists, roads, sawmills, and logging railroads have done for it, or to it. Again, a spectacular landscape, seemingly untouched by humanity, is eventually tarnished through development. Although the essays referred to here were written years, if not decades after the fact, with both the benefit and bias of hindsight, the fear of civilization's encroachment was there from the very beginning. The majority undoubtedly want all the automobile roads, summer hotels, graded trails, and other modern conveniences that we can give them. It is already decided, and wisely, that they shall have these things as rapidly as brains and money can provide them. But a very substantial minority, I think, want just the opposite. To a certain extent, Leopold accepted that the landscape changes these demands would entail were inevitable, valid even, but there had to be a line. Efforts to expose people to the wonders of nature threatened to wipe out the very nature people traveled to see. As he later wrote in a Same County Almanac, all conservation of wildness is self-defeating. For to cherish, we must see and fondle, and when enough have seen and fondled, there is no wilderness left to cherish. Even if such conservation proved self-defeating, these places were too precious to not at least try to protect. And it was in fact this mentality, a minority fighting to maintain nature's beauties, that informed Leopold's proposal, while working for the Forest Service in the Southwest to establish the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. The Gila is a vibrant anomaly within the surrounding Chihuahua Desert. Fed by a perennial stream in an ecosystem normally starved for water, these rugged mountains and valleys, apart from their stunning geology, harbor lush vegetation and abundant wildlife. Various indigenous peoples have inhabited this area for centuries, such as the archaic Mogollon culture, known for its striking cliff dwellings, and the Chiricahua Apache. In conducting an inspection of the Gila National Forest in the spring of 1922, Leopold made the case for setting aside a region around the river's headwaters as protected wilderness. Specifically, he suggested the prohibition of road construction as well as permanent improvements like summer homes, lodges, and hotels. Other areas in the region of substantial wilderness character had succumbed to the good roads movement and the insidious expansion of auto travel in the few years prior. In many ways, it was a last chance at keeping such vast, untamed nature intact, at least in the Southwest. After working its way up the chain of command within the Forest Service, Leopold's proposed wilderness area, encompassing 750,000 acres, was finally approved on June 3, 1924. It was initially only secure within Forest Service Region 3, the southwestern unit encompassing Arizona and New Mexico, and the original tract suffered an acreage reduction, reclassification, and the construction of a road right through the middle before the Wilderness Act was passed 40 years later and granted federal protection to the area. Because Leopold was behind the proposal that led to the world's first ever wilderness designation, something of his particular views on wilderness were canonized into federal law and permeated into the broader cultural imagination and understanding of what makes wild places and what makes these places worth protecting. Wilderness exists at a remove. It is necessarily distinct from the rest of civilization, valuable insofar as it differs from and contrasts with workaday life. There's something delicate and fragile about it. People may visit and pass through, but shall not remain. This human-free quality also intersects with what is perhaps the most critical facet of wilderness. It cannot be recreated. Wilderness is a resource which can shrink but not grow. Invasions can be arrested or modified in a manner to keep an area usable either for recreation, or for science, or for wildlife, but the creation of new wilderness in the full sense of the word is impossible. The human presence in these places is welcomed, or at least tolerated, to the extent that it doesn't compromise their core essence of wildness. Leopold undoubtedly helped shape the narrative in many ways, and it's his words I aim to understand. But I also wanted to see how others thought about and experienced wilderness. After all, as he himself would say, all this was far away and long ago. What does this idea mean for us now, 100 years later? How does Leopold's legacy continue to inform engagement with wild places? And how have wilderness concepts and experiences evolved since this first designation? I had the privilege of interviewing 3 individuals from different environmental careers and backgrounds, and asking about their favorite places, memories, or experiences in wilderness. Specifically, I led with the question, is there a favorite spot you have in nature that could be considered wilderness to some degree? My own favorite wild spot would hardly fit the Wilderness Act's criteria, and I wanted to be open to the possibility that, as Leopold once wrote, wilderness exists in all degrees for others too.
Michelle Doerr. I am the president and founder of Anaba Consulting LLC. I am a former wildlife biologist. I did a lot of work on human-wildlife conflict before I actually ended up in the archery industry, and then started my own company back in 2017. And I say now that 90% of wildlife management is people management, but we didn't get that in school, so I'm trying to fill that gap. I grew up and now live back in Glencoe, Minnesota, on the family farm. When it comes to wilderness, I am attracted to probably some of the most wildest places on earth. The Serengeti in Africa, anywhere in Australia, the Galapagos Islands, probably multiple places in Africa, Europe. So I love wild places. If I have to choose a vacation, that's probably where it's going to be, to a wild place more than a urban place. I only read Leopold maybe 10 years ago. And in my work in and study of eco-psychology, I ended up back with Leopold because some of those texts mentioned. And then I ended up reading Sand County Almanac, and I have since really just globbed on to everything that is in there, not only the creative stories. We were just talking about chickadees. The chickadee is my favorite bird, so I was attracted to that, but also everything around the land ethic. And I think reading it later in my career really helped me consider things that he's written about a little bit more deeply than I would have earlier in my career. So I bring up Leopold often. When I'm reading other books on conservation, I'll write Leopold in the side if something triggers me. So I'm more familiar, although I am still far, far, far from an expert on Leopold.
My name's Mrill, Ingram, and I am an environmental geographer. And I have done a variety of research and writing about the environment for my whole career, really in a general sense, just interested in the different kinds of relationships that we develop as human beings to the world around us. And so I've looked at policy, looked at things like agricultural practices, infrastructure, land management. How do we sort of guide and shape the way we relate to the land? I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and my dad worked for the Sierra Club and was very active in fighting proposed dams, and one in particular along the Colorado River, damming the Grand Canyon. I was able to travel to the Grand Canyon many times and to other wilderness areas around the Southwest, and it was an amazing opportunity to be outside and to just kind of experience this gorgeous, beautiful world, and to hear people talk a lot about the importance of protection and keeping a place where humans did not define everything. That awareness of wilderness has always been a really important part for me of when I think about environment and why I do environmental work. So it sits there as a very foundational idea, even though over time I've come to see the concept of wilderness as very dynamic and in many ways very fraught. But I remember those early experiences and that sense of being but one piece of this incredibly diverse, wild, and wonderful world, and not a very important piece. And I think that in many ways that's the seed of what kind of wilderness is about. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting continuity between a wilderness area, however you might define it, but that concept of what that feels like that can be realized just about anywhere. So that informs kind of the whole span of work that I've done related to the environment. The first time that I remember hearing about Aldo Leopold was after graduating from high school, and at that point I had fixed on the notion that environmental work was important, but writing about the environment was one way I wanted to participate. Someone gave me a copy of Sand County Almanac, and I honestly couldn't tell you. I don't remember my immediate impressions of the book. I remember certain sort of feelings, passages, the time in the Gila, because I was a Southwesterner. Knowing that Aldo Leopold had been in the Southwest was something that really resonated. When I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, after a while I started working at the Arboretum. And the University of Wisconsin Arboretum here, Aldo Leopold was foundational in the setting up of the Arboretum, and it's a lot of what goes on there today is very much informed by his ideas. And so during that time, it became much more familiar. There was an annual reading of his work. And then, of course, just being in Wisconsin, there's a strong presence of Aldo Leopold in many things. And then as I began to think more about wilderness, it was certainly the way that Aldo Leopold tangled with the notion of wilderness and wrote about it that was sort of part of my growing awareness of all of the different ways that it can be defined and thought about and practiced.
My name is Ernie Atencio, and I live in my ancestral homeland of northern New Mexico in a village called Arroyo Hondo, just north of Taos. My current job is as I'm Southwest Regional Director for National Parks Conservation Association. So I supervise all our work and staff in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. You know, I think it all started really on an outward bound course. I had an opportunity for a full scholarship for a 23-day wilderness trip right after high school, and it was just the most amazing thing I'd ever done. I grew up in kind of a rough inner city neighborhood, had this yearning to be outdoors, but didn't really know how to manifest that, and I had this opportunity. So that kind of set me on the path to a career for a few years as an outdoor instructor. I worked for Outward Bound, led a number of outdoor programs, ended up later going back to school to get my bachelor's degree in anthropology. And at that time, I ended up with a job with the National Park Service, working as a ranger in Mesa Verde for a few years. Worked at a few other parks. And then, just little by little, always been concerned about environmental issues. Honestly, when I was younger, I had no idea how to even get involved, but just something that little by little I got into. Initially, I think I'd say through some environmental journalism, writing for High Country News. And then after graduate school in applied culture and anthropology, I had an opportunity to come back to northern New Mexico to work for a small advocacy nonprofit here in Taos that worked on river and water quality issues in the state. And so that was, I jumped at the opportunity partly for the job, the opportunity to learn this type of work, and also as an opportunity to come back to my roots. Growing up around Denver, and maybe I think this is pretty normal for kids, just any opportunity to be out in some natural location, a little wood lot, an old abandoned farm or orchard, riding our little Stingray bikes through abandoned lots and fields. I don't know, just always felt drawn to those kinds of places and experiences. In my early teen years, we used to get my folks to drive us up to the Rocky Mountain foothills just outside of Denver and drop us off at some place along a little stream for the weekend, just to camp with some friends. And initially that was just an opportunity, an excuse for us to do illicit things. and then little by little, we just really started getting into it and looked up and thought, I'll bet we could make it to the top of that mountain. So we'd start doing a little hiking. And then from the top of that mountain, we'd look across and say, I'll bet if you go over that next ridge, it goes to another valley and it goes back downstream. And so we just started exploring, and we kind of made up backpacking without any backpacks. Like we would carry grocery bags full of food, paper grocery bags, and these, 15-pound Coleman sleeping bags over our shoulders. And around that same time, I also just became fascinated by early Western history in North America. And some of the early European explorations, got really into the Lewis and Clark expedition, the whole mountain man history, and then indigenous history, of course, as part of that, and just feeling like, God, it was just a paradise here. Look what we've done, right? So that was always part of my consciousness. So when I had this opportunity for the Outward Bound trip and 3 weeks in the wilderness, it was just like, I was just given this incredible gift and just cut loose in this wild world. And I felt so comfortable there. I enjoyed every physical challenge of it, every mental challenge of it. There's something about it, just simplifying life to this boiled down, stripped down version
I have read Santa County Almanac at least a couple of times um, as part of school assignments back in the college days. I've worked with organizations here in New Mexico. The New Mexico Wildlife Federation, I think, was founded by Aldo Leopold. I've worked closely with them. I worked with another organization. It was a coalition of ranchers environmentalists. And that was one point of commonality that we shared, is really valuing Aldo Leopold and his thoughts about the land ethic and how to manage places appropriately.
If I think of wilderness and my favorite place in wilderness, it would have to be the Galapagos Islands. When I visited there back in 2010, not only was it an amazing experience it was my daughter and my mother and 5 other women biologists. We got to see some incredible, unique animals, but also there was a spot, Fernandino Island. The electricity was turned off at midnight and not back on until 6 a.m. And so we could watch the southern lights without electricity. And it was literally the most peaceful place on earth. But also, I have a seasonal RV at a campsite. It's about 1,200 acres. I can go hiking about on most weekdays in the summer. I'm the only person there. And I can get just as much peace from that place if I'm really intentional about it as I could when I was in the Galapagos.
Certainly, as someone who's been around for a little while, humanly speaking, I've been to many, many places on Earth and have, felt just tremendously fortunate to be there. I work hard physically and mentally to get away from humans into wilderness areas on an annual basis, and every time I take a trip, I end up someplace that was sort of more spectacular than the other. Just this past year was in both Navajo reservation land in northern Arizona, and then also up north beyond Thunder Bay in Ontario. Both those trips took quite some effort to get to, but then was able to just spend days being there and enjoying them. Again, it's just immersion in a world it's got so many sights and sounds and feelings, and it's just the experience of kind of being in the context of something that's absolutely not human.
I've had just incredible privilege of being in a lot of wild places over the years. Backpacked through the Gila many years ago on a month-long trip, and the Sangre de Cristos just outside my back door. Spent a lot of time in the Grand Canyon over the years. I worked there for a few years as a ranger, and those kinds of big wild experiences are, I really treasure those. They are so important. I'm so happy to know that places like that are going to be there for my kids and grandkids. We live on 5 acres here, not far from the Rio Grande Gorge, and it's mostly just sage. It's not a rich and biodiverse habitat, but I'm just always fascinated by little things I see out there, little sprigs and sprouts of plants, signs of wildlife that have been passing through. Even just the simple curvature of the landscape and drainages, and it might seem a little overly simplistic, but if you allow yourself to really pay attention to what's around you in any halfway natural place, you'll find a lot of fascinating little details and things that will raise questions about how did this happen? Why does this work? How are these things connected? So I see it kind of every day.
Serenity, adventure, wonder, excitement, joy. These positive qualities of wild nature are undeniable, and a century on from the designation of the first wilderness area, they are still very much alive and well. Thanks to Leopold's ingenuity, foresight, and dogged persistence, and his broader legacy of conservation and respectful engagement with the land, special places can continue to be enjoyed and cherished in all kinds of ways by all kinds of people. Having the legal framework in place for certain spots doesn't preclude appreciation or enjoyment of wildness found elsewhere. And even if this wildness isn't protected in the same way, the spirit and experience of Big W wilderness can carry over into these other areas too. But I can't stop thinking about Leopold's cynical, despairing tone. The fact that it was fear of something being destroyed that lit a fire under him. The fact that in looking back on other wild places he'd known, that fear had come true. Maybe it's not so much a mandate for the rest of us, or wisdom we should follow. Maybe it's more personal. The more I thought about it, the more I recognized that I've felt fear like his over my own beloved wild places, worrying that forces out of my control will change their very nature, that I'll never experience that same wonder or joy again. The more I researched, the more I realized that these feelings aren't unique to Leopold or to me.
When I hear that quote, I actually go back to the Galapagos. There's a part of me that would really love to revisit there. And at the same time, I do think it would, it's that first experience at such an amazing place that can't be replaced. But also the relationships that we built while we were there. My daughter was in the middle of an eating disorder, actually, and that was part of our recovery. And I can't ever replace that experience. So that's been over 10 years ago. I don't actually want to imagine what it looks like now. Even though the Galapagos are very highly protected, I really don't want to think about the additional tourism and maybe even the effects of climate change that have showed up there. I don't want to think about it. I do want to keep that experience that I had close to my heart.
Personally, where I feel like I have experienced that most is just in terms of the sheer numbers of people, especially during COVID, when suddenly the whole concept of camper vans and camping at large in Forest Service or BLM lands, it just exploded. And I live right next door to BLM lands here, and it was just overrun. There was one area where there's a trailhead that goes down to the bottom of the gorge where there's a hot springs property. It's a beautiful spot. BLM ended up having to close that because it was just getting so trashed. And there were, semi-permanent camps that were popping up here and there. And I acknowledge that part of that is my personal experience in my younger years, having places like that all to myself, right? Or you could so easily find places to camp that were not overrun by other campers, that were not trashed by other campers. And I appreciate and think it's important that more and more people are discovering wild places and enjoying them. If they could treat them a little bit more respect, that would be nice. But I think I was very fortunate to come of age when I did, and had a lot of wild experiences in wild places that are not very wild anymore, because they've turned into essentially undesignated campgrounds. That kind of raises another part of it. For instance, at Bears Ears National Monument, I've spent a lot of time out there over the years. My first trip to that area was in 1978, and spent a lot of time backpacking in some of the canyons up in Bears Ears over the years, long before it was even considered as a national monument. But as soon as it became a national monument, it's on the map and it's been discovered. There's been, rock art, rock imagery panels that have been desecrated just by mindless, careless tourists. And there's been other damage, just sites that were completely off the map that nobody really knew about. If suddenly there's directions on how to get to this or that remote site that you can find all over the place online. People find a place, they love it, they enjoy it, they want to share it. That's all totally natural. But these days with social media, it just means hordes more people are going to be there. And what you originally loved about the place is not going to, it's going to disappear. Um, so that's a, yeah, that's another bit of, I guess, what I'd call eco grief.
I have one experience that I would share that comes from the top of the Huachuca Mountains in southeast Arizona. Growing up in Tucson, they were a bit of a drive, but they were one of the places one could go to have this kind of amazing experience of hiking several thousand feet from, high desert up into a mountain top where there were giant trees, snow during the winter. It was just an alpine kind of sky island experience, as they're called down there. I was on my own, and 2 to 3 years ago took a hike up there. Places have burned and burned repeatedly, and then not been able to grow back the same way they were. Right away I could see, sort of looking up, coming out of the canyon and looking across at other ridges, I could see where places had burned. And then as I started to move across the ridges and in and out of the folds of the mountains, I had this experience of there being these smaller protected places where there were still these huge mother trees, these Douglas fir, big beautiful trees, and this whole sense of being surrounded in this kind of deep, endless forest, and you couldn't see too far because there was vegetation and stuff. And then all of a sudden coming out on a ridgetop which had been burned repeatedly, and there being no trees at all, maybe one or two trying to regenerate, but it being dominated by this scrub, and it looked so small. I could see everywhere. I could see the other ridges, and I just had this sense of like, well, there really isn't even very much land here. And then I would go back tucked into another fold of the earth where the fire hadn't burned, and again would immediately feel completely surrounded by these trees, but then just no sense of like how big it was. So it felt like it could, these forests could go on forever. And that was an incredibly dramatic experience, because knowing what I know about climate change and the fact that ecosystem is disappearing and may well in my lifetime, and certainly in the top of the Huachuca, it was not there. These little tiny islands of those giant fir, and then nothing. Because I grew up going to those skylines, that was just this destination point from from way back from when I was little, and the loss of that was it was tragic for me. And I think although I've been thinking about climate change for a very long time, that felt like a very, very personal loss, and something from childhood too, which was very, very bitter, very hard. But being the kind of person I am, I also was just, forced myself to look around, and I also had a spectacular time. It was beautiful. And I think it's part of what fed my determination to continue being an environmentalist, basically.
Ecological or environmental grief is the feeling of loss and mourning around experienced or anticipated losses in the natural world. Grieving irreversible changes in the landscape, whether they've already happened or have yet to come. As I mentioned, Leopold is in fact credited as one of the first people to describe eco-grief. While scientists in ecological and environmental disciplines are especially at risk of being affected by the world's wounds, given their specialized work and dedication to certain species, habitats, or ecosystems, any of us can feel this pain. One article from 2021 by writer Melissa Godin sought to capture contemporary experiences of eco-grief from different folks around the world. Charity Wanja of Malawi described a favorite spot along the bank of the Sherry River where she and her family had celebrated special occasions, but a devastating flood in 2015 washed away all the plant life and soil. Echoing what Leopold wrote in a Sand County almanac, Wanja said of the riverbank, "I've never gone back to visit since. I just feel sad and angry, especially when I hear stories from my mother about the old days." Ecological grief is especially painful, as the land reflects something of our life histories and identities. When the land is altered or degraded, it threatens the integrity and stability of our sense of self. Glenn Albrecht coined a term for this experience in 2005, solastalgia, defined as a form of homesickness one gets when one is still at home, or a loss of belonging when the place you belong to transforms around you and is no longer as it once was. The wild places Leopold explored in Mexico and the American Southwest may not have fully been home, in the sense that Leopold and his family lived in the much more urbanized city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the areas mentioned in his writings were spots he traveled to, but they left a significant mark on him. Leopold's formative early career experiences as a forest ranger played out in these breathtaking landscapes, awe infused with belonging as the freedom to explore echoed his childhood experiences in nature. To some extent, seeing the degradation and appropriation that took place later on struck the visceral chord of his very upbringing. As a young boy playing along the banks of the Mississippi River, Leopold took a particular liking to one little area that he claimed as his favorite swamp woods. One day, in coming back to this spot, he discovered that someone was now squatting in the area and had cleared it to plant corn. The turn of events angered young Leopold. While a flood later swept away the squatter and his corn and set little Aldo's world to rights, that feeling of loss and powerlessness was not as easily washed away. After all, it was fear and anxiety over what others might do to special places in nature that eventually drove Leopold towards conceiving the wilderness designation. Despite the culturally significant legacy of Leopold's eco-anxiety, these types of reactions to environmental losses are often pathologized as delusional or exaggerated, especially when it comes to future-oriented concern or preemptive mourning. Emotions like grief and anxiety are valid responses to loss and threat and demonstrate our attachments to the world around us. Leopold wrote as much in a Sand County almanac, "We only grieve for what we know." An ecological grief expert, Ashley Consolo, echoes the sentiment, "We only grieve what we love. We are only scared to lose what matters." If these are natural reactions to a changing environment, then what lies behind the stigma?
I mean, in the field of conservation, we don't talk about emotions at all. We try to, push them away. These are normal reactions to loss. And that's the other thing with conservation is I don't think when you think of loss, we're not very good at processing loss. And that's a psychological thing, right? Processing what that loss is, naming it, and oh my gosh, telling others how we might feel about that loss. But on the alternate side, the other thing that we don't do well is we don't celebrate. And I think the two of them go together. If you're not grieving well, you're not celebrating well.
Societal mores around grief in general are highly restrictive. That is, only certain types of losses tend to be validated and legitimized, such as the death of close family members or partners, while losses outside of these, whether more nebulous and harder to understand or involving connections and relationships deemed less important, are made invisible or else pathologized. But these disenfranchised emotions can metastasize. Unaddressed or undermined, they can have persistent negative effects on a person's well-being and ability to function, and in some cases manifest as chronic anxiety or PTSD. This potential for grief to become debilitating is another reason it gets stigmatized, even as its stigmatization is part of what pushes it to that point in the first place. There's certainly a discussion to be had about whether catastrophizing environmental outcomes is maladaptive and fear-mongering, or whether it's a realistic set of predictions given the current circumstances. But in either case, this state of despair is rooted in cynicism. So much of the environmental messaging we've received over the past few decades takes this everything's doomed angle, and it can feel wearying to be bombarded with this pessimistic worldview. Theologian Hannah Malcolm argues that encouraging or stoking despair in others is a form of cruelty, because these feelings presume the ultimate outcome, rob us of alternative ways of imagining our future.
Although despairing feelings are normal, living in a state of despair is basically a form of arrogance, right? It rests on the assumption that you know what is going to happen. And there's a really dark side to despair, which is that we almost want to see our despair vindicated, right? That we imagine that we'll be right.
Leopold in the Green Lagoons does take this authoritative tone on wilderness, assuming that man always kills the thing he loves, and thus cementing the inevitability of losing or destroying the environment. He did write this essay long after his travels had concluded, and he was reflecting on his old haunts with the Second World War as a backdrop, the dismal state of global affairs bringing out his own cynicism. In this context, his proclamations make a dark kind of sense. If all he saw around him was destruction, if the places he had once found solace were unrecognizable, what room was there for hope? What could compel him to revisit the wilderness when the world at large was no longer safe? With the modern realities of climate change, we might feel the same. Turning away seems like our only option, the only control we have. In a society that fails to recognize the legitimacy of ecological grief, that doesn't grant us the space to honor lost or altered relationships to place, that stigmatizes our feelings or callously piles onto them, it's no wonder people in pain turn bitter. And when wilderness, the supposedly last human-free part of the earth and impossible to recreate, succumbs to civilization, the devastation can seem insurmountable. Never revisiting is both a literal truth when wilderness ceases to exist, but it also serves as a coping mechanism, an attempt to bypass the pain. But according to ecological grief expert Ashley Consolo, not grieving is not desirable, even if it were possible. After all, grief reflects our attachment to the natural world and how connected we are to it, even when it's physically lost to us. For all the ways it could pull us toward despair, grieving can also be full of resistance, of creativity, of collectivity, and of hope. It can revitalize our energy and allow us to reinvest meaning in granting ourselves the space to feel, in honoring our own experiences as valid, as reasonable, in making our eco-grief visible. We can make this pain our greatest power.
If grief doesn't move into mourning and into action with some kind of a communal dynamic, it does seem to just overwhelm us and leave us with this sense of cynicism and futility. So there is something about the rawness of it and the wildness of it that has movement. It's not a stagnant place to live.
Thus, it is in its motivational force that it can serve as a driver of change, of connection, reconnection, and imagining, of designating, protecting, and securing the wilderness.
People are longing for a place to be able to talk about this. You may not have a place right near you, but I assure you there are other people out there, and I would encourage you just to be brave and talk, find a nearby ally and just bring it up and see what happens, experiment. And I think you might be surprised at how many people, even if they don't know some of the terms and you can sort of explain the emotions around it, I think you'll find more people resonate with you than you might have imagined. If you think of a place, like if I am stressed out for any reason and I can't go to a wild place of any kind, whether it be, nearby wilderness or far away wilderness, if I can close my eyes and imagine myself back in the Galapagos or some other wild place that I've been, it literally can affect your body that way and settle it in a very similar manner. And there's research out there as actually being there. So I think there's some research on, even patients in hospitals that view nature. So it has a similar effect. So you can revisit that wilderness area in your mind and body without actually being there in the present.
Very, very differently from that, it seems to me the responsibility is to keep an eye, to revisit, to pay attention, and find in all of the different ways that you can to protect and to support. So and again, because my work has growing up in wilderness areas where you weren't really sure when the last time a human came through here, and it's probably been a while, to just living in the Midwest where wilderness areas are far away. And my focus, has very much been like, how do you connect things that would allow people to really begin to embrace possibilities for wilderness right where they live. This notion of respect and responsibility and paying attention, seeing who's around, thinking about what they might need. What kind of practices are you doing that could acknowledge them, give them a little space or support, or just be respectful? That's a kind of practice, I think, which would be why I would absolutely revisit. And then is also something that I think can kind of connect the notion of a preserved wilderness way far away from us and what can happen, right around us in our backyard.
I don't see it that way anymore. I have revisited a lot of my favorite wild places numerous times over the years. And every time I find something new and beautiful and exciting, and maybe it's in part just the experience of being there. I think for me, wild places have been where I always feel my best. I just feel more focused, more grounded, more connected in some way to the world. And even if, I've been backpacking many times in the Grand Canyon, and every single time, even on the same trail, every single trip is different. And I'm thinking about the quote that you can never run the same river twice, because it's different every time you run it, right? And I feel the same way about any wild places. And I think it's possible and it's important to find that joy and that connection with every experience in a wild place. If we live in a place where you enjoy an experience in a wild place so much that you never want to go back there, thinking that it's just not quite going to be the same, that strikes me as a little sad. And I think that we need to treasure and value these places, even if we just keep going back to the same places over and over again.
Even in any place in nature now, maybe it's the process I've gone through, I find beauty everywhere. Even if there's, some aspect of destruction or something like that, I can always find some beauty somewhere. Maybe that's my personality, who knows, but I can find it. So I don't think when I'm with nature somewhere that it affects me as much, because I know that is the very place I need to go to manage and process and let my body, experience the life force that nature is. But I can't really, other than the family farm, I can't really name a place with nature that I feel that eco grief in the present. Well, on occasion, maybe if I'm not hearing as many birds as I think should be there, then there's a momentary thought of loss. But otherwise, I really try to focus on what is there, like the woodpeckers that are flying around right now.
Despite the fact that Leopold didn't live to see the world's reception of a Sand County Almanac, he was without a doubt trying to reach out to like-minded people, to identify and empower his substantial minority. Even if he at times felt isolated and alone in his experiences, these renowned life achievements reveal his gravitation toward community, and community as he imagined it, with the boundaries enlarged beyond just other humans to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. Our feelings of eco-grief matter then because we are part of the biotic community. Leopold believed that we can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. And I would argue that those are the very conditions that open us up to grief and anxiety. and that such pain and worry are the natural inverses of joy, wonder, comfort, and security. Ecological grief and anxiety signal the rupture or potential rupture of our relationships to the earth, and they drive us to do something to mend and repair. The legacy of Leopold's proposal for wilderness designation has enabled the protection of so many spectacular places and human connections with them. Imagine what the last 100 years might have been like if not for Leopold and the Gila. A Sand County Almanac, too, has left an incredible impact. Even though it's just one man's and one family's relationship with the land, we're given such an intimate view of what that connection looks like, and so many of us have taken inspiration from that and cultivated our own stories within the natural world. Essays like the Green Lagoons, then, can feel contradictory and confusing. How could someone like Aldo Leopold, so connected to the earth, whose legacy was born out of continual return and repeated engagement with the land, say never to revisit? Whether it's comfortable or not, this seeming paradox of pain tied up with joy and loss with love is part and parcel of caring about the environment. As Leopold's wisdom suggests, the duality begs the question, to revisit or not? To live with only the memory, or to go back and face the reality, whatever it may be. As someone without even a fraction of the influence and notoriety, I'd like to offer a response to Leopold. From my year of exploration into this topic, from the people I interviewed, from my readings and interpretations and deep study of Leopold, and from my own experiences with varying degrees of wilderness. It is the part of wisdom never to abandon the wild landscapes we love. If they're lost, we can honor them in memory and forge new connections. If they're still here, we return to ensure they stay, not just for our sake, but for the wider, wilder world. We must revisit to create community with soils, waters, plants, animals, and people, to have a chance to be part of the narrative and rewrite the story. We must revisit to learn what we're up against and what we can do to protect our most beloved landscapes. It's not always easy, and it's not always joyful. But if this wildness means something to us, then it's worth giving it our heart.